Welcome back to Exploring American Religion, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on another journey of knowledge and discovery. Friends, religion has always been an inseparable part of American history and culture. From the earliest pilgrims to the incredible diversity of faiths today, religion has shaped this nation in ways you might not even imagine. So, how can we truly understand this complex and multifaceted religious landscape? The answer lies in the book we're going to dissect today, the Oxford Handbook of Religion in America. This isn't just any book, it's a monumental collection of research, compiled by leading experts on American religion. This handbook is like a treasure map, filled with invaluable knowledge about the history, denominations, culture, society, and contemporary issues related to religion in America. In today's video, I'll be your book analyst and guide, leading us deep into each chapter and theme of the Oxford Handbook of Religion in America. We'll explore its unique structure, rich content, and immense value. We'll pay special attention to key historical milestones to trace the evolution of American religion over time. I'm confident that after watching this video, you'll not only understand the Oxford Handbook of Religion in America better, but also feel a newfound appreciation and curiosity for American religious history. Are you ready for this journey of discovery? Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. Overview and Importance of the Oxford Handbook of Religion in America. 1.1. Why this handbook matters. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America is not your typical introductory textbook. It is a comprehensive scholarly compendium that offers multiple vantage points on the historical, cultural, and theological development of religion in the United States. Edited by leading scholars, it incorporates contributions from various experts, each focusing on a specific dimension of American religious life. This format is invaluable for anyone who wants a broad yet detailed understanding spanning the origins of religious thought in colonial America, the evolution of Protestant denominations, the growth of Catholicism, the Jewish presence, the rise of non-Christian faiths, and the myriad of newer spiritual movements. Importantly, the handbook delves into topics often glossed over in more superficial surveys. For instance, it doesn't just mention the existence of diverse religions, it contextualizes them within broader trends such as immigration patterns, social reform movements, and political transformations. Through this lens, readers learn how each religious group interacts with and is shaped by the nation's legal framework, particularly the American principle of church-state separation and the ongoing debates surrounding religious freedom. 1.2. Structure and Scope. The handbook is typically organized into sections dealing with chronological periods, e.g., colonial era, 19th century awakenings, 20th century developments, post-1960s, shifts, major religious traditions, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, etc., and overarching themes like revivalism, civil religion, politics, gender, and social justice. Each section is carefully curated to deliver depth without sacrificing accessibility. Scholars in American religious history, sociology, anthropology, theology, and political science all contribute, allowing for a rich tapestry of perspectives. One of its standout features is the attention paid to marginalized and emerging movements. While many historical overviews highlight well-known revivals like the First and Second Great Awakenings, this handbook goes deeper, examining lesser-studied phenomena such as the interplay between race and religion, the significance of new religious movements in the 20th century, e.g., Pentecostalism, New Age movements, contemporary paganism, and the transitions spurred by immigration from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. 1.3. methodologies, and scholarly rigor. At its core, this handbook reflects the rigorous methodologies of modern religious studies. From archival analyses to ethnographic fieldwork, from quantitative data to textual critique, the scholarship here is broad-based. This rigorous approach ensures that the conclusions drawn about American religion, its rise, evolution, and current state are well substantiated, not mere speculation. It's this multiplicity of methods and perspectives that makes the work particularly enlightening. A religious historian might use diaries or sermons to illustrate the mindset of 18th century Puritans, while an anthropologist could examine contemporary spiritual practices through interviews and participant observation. Political scientists might analyze legislation and court rulings that have shaped the free exercise of religion. All of these angles come together to form a 360-degree view of religion in America. 1.4. Why now more than ever? We live in an era where the role of religion in public life is both scrutinized and evolving. Issues of religious freedom, pluralism, and identity politics stand at the forefront of cultural and political debates. Understanding the complexities of religion in America is crucial not just for academics, but also for policymakers, community leaders, and engaged citizens. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America offers foundational insights for anyone looking to navigate these current realities with a nuanced perspective grounded in historical context. Chapter 2: Origins of Religious Diversity in America. 2.1. Pre-colonial and indigenous spiritual traditions. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the lands that would become the United States were inhabited by numerous indigenous communities with their own rich spiritualities. These diverse belief systems were deeply integrated with natural elements, rivers, mountains, forests, and communal practices, including rituals, festivals, and ceremonies that reinforced a sense of belonging and responsibility to the tribe and the land. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America underscores how these native cosmologies were far from monolithic. Tribes such as the Iroquois, Pueblo, Navajo, and many others each had unique myths of creation, deity concepts, and ritual practices. Some communities believed in powerful creator gods, while others revered a pantheon of spirits closely tied to natural forces. This diversity set the stage for a broader tapestry of religious plurality that would later include European Christianity, African spiritualities, and more. Yet, it is crucial to understand that these indigenous traditions underwent profound disruptions with the onset of colonization. Disease, war, forced migration, and cultural assimilation policies, like the establishment of mission schools, deeply impacted these communities. Even in the face of upheaval, many indigenous spiritual practices have persisted, adapted, or integrated certain elements of Christianity, leading to a multifaceted religious identity among Native Americans today. 2.2. European colonization and the seeds of pluralism. When Europeans arrived in the early 16th and 17th centuries, they brought with them various Christian denominations, most prominently Anglicanism, Puritanism, Catholicism, and Quakerism. Different colonial powers influenced different regions. For example, the French in the north and along the Mississippi River spread Catholic missions, while the Spanish in the southwest also championed Catholic evangelization. The English colonies along the eastern seaboard were more religiously diverse, with Puritans in New England, Anglicans in the South, and Quakers in Pennsylvania. This patchwork of colonial religious communities laid the groundwork for an evolving pluralism. The Puritans, seeking religious freedom for themselves, inadvertently set a precedent that contributed to the concept of a broader religious tolerance, though they were often intolerant of dissenters in their own communities. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania became a haven for Quakers and other persecuted sects, fostering ideas of pacifism and egalitarianism that would play significant roles in later social movements. A key takeaway is that these early colonial religious experiments were not uniform. Each colony had its own version of church-state relationships, sometimes enforcing strict conformity, sometimes allowing a degree of latitude. This diversity prefigured the debates that would shape the nation's constitutional commitment to religious freedom. 2.3. The First Great Awakening, a religious revival. In the 1730s and 1740s, a massive wave of revivalist fervor swept through the colonies, often referred to as the First Great Awakening. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield ignited religious zeal, emphasizing personal conversion experiences, emotional preaching, and the sovereignty of God's grace. This movement transcended denominational boundaries, creating new impetus for evangelical outreach and forging a collective religious identity among colonists. The Oxford Handbook highlights how the First Great Awakening democratized religion to some extent, reducing the power of established churches and ecclesiastical hierarchies. By prioritizing individual piety and a born-again experience, revivalism empowered laypeople to take spiritual authority into their own hands, foreshadowing broader American ideals about individual rights and liberty. 2.4. The influence of Enlightenment thought. Simultaneously, Enlightenment ideas about reason, human rights, and scientific inquiry were infiltrating colonial intellectual circles. Thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu influenced American founders, nudging them toward a view of religion that emphasized rational inquiry and personal conscience. This philosophical current would eventually contribute to the creation of a constitution that guarded against the establishment of a national church, thus institutionalizing religious pluralism. The interplay between revivalist fervor and Enlightenment rationalism set the tone for a religious landscape that valued both emotional piety and intellectual freedom. While these two strands sometimes clashed, they also created a unique American ethos, where faith and reason could coexist in various forms, shaping the policies and cultural attitudes of the new nation. Chapter 3. Religion and the Founding of the American Republic. 3.1. Religious Motivations Behind the Revolution. By the mid-18th century, the American colonies were brimming with both Enlightenment ideals and revivalist fervor. Many colonists interpreted their political struggle against British rule through a spiritual lens. Sermons framed the conflict as a battle for God-given rights, encouraging unity and resistance to perceived tyranny. The concept of civil religion began to crystallize during this period. Political leaders, often influenced by Christian rhetoric, proclaimed that the colonies had a divine mandate to forge a new nation grounded in liberty. At the same time, secular Enlightenment principles underscored the importance of reason and individual autonomy. This interplay between religious conviction and political ideology powered the drive toward independence and the eventual creation of the United States. 3.2. The Declaration of Independence and Religious Freedom. Drafted in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, while not explicitly Christian, invoked the laws of nature and of nature's God. Thomas Jefferson, its primary author, was heavily influenced by Enlightenment deism, a belief in a creator who does not intervene in worldly affairs. Nevertheless, the religious language within the document resonated with devout Christians who saw the hand of providence in the nation's founding. Subsequently, debates raged about how religion would function in the new republic. Some states maintained established churches for years, e.g., Congregationalism in parts of New England, whereas others moved quickly toward disestablishment. Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, 1786, served as an influential model, emphasizing that individuals should be free to follow their conscience without government interference. This statute foreshadowed the principle of religious liberty, enshrined in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1791. 3.3. The Constitution and Church-State Separation. The U.S. Constitution itself, drafted in 1787, is notable for its near silence on religion. It contains no explicit mention of God or Christianity, reflecting the founders' intent to create a government that, while not hostile to religion, would not be built upon a religious foundation. Article 5's prohibition of religious tests for public office was groundbreaking, ensuring that no single denomination could dominate civic life at the federal level. The First Amendment followed, stating, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." This dual clause, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, became a cornerstone of American religious freedom, generating endless debates about their practical implications. Over time, these clauses have been interpreted by courts in ways that attempt to balance the protection of individual religious expression with maintaining a secular public sphere. The Oxford Handbook provides in-depth discussions on the historical context and later legal interpretations of these constitutional provisions. The result is an evolving debate that has taken on new dimensions in modern times, as American society grows increasingly diverse in its religious makeup. Chapter 4. The Second Great Awakening and Social Reform. English Version. 4.1. Emergence of the Second Great Awakening. The early 19th century saw another sweeping religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening. Spanning roughly from the 1790s to the 1840s, this movement was characterized by vibrant camp meetings, emotional preaching, and a focus on personal salvation through faith in Christ. Leaders like Charles Grandison Finney, among others, ignited fervor across frontier regions and growing urban centers alike. The movement gave rise to a wave of conversions, sometimes referred to as the born-again experience, further democratizing religious authority. Many historians note that this revival was closely linked to the dynamic social changes of the time. As the United States expanded westward, communities in frontier territories craved spiritual cohesion and moral structure. The egalitarian ethos of the new republic found a parallel in revivalist teachings, which emphasized that salvation was accessible to all, regardless of social standing. Congregations flourished, and denominational competition spurred innovation in preaching and community outreach. 4.2. Growth of evangelical denominations. Evangelical denominations such as the Baptists and Methodists experienced explosive growth during and after the Second Great Awakening. Methodists, for instance, employed an itinerant preacher system where circuit riders would travel to distant settlements. This mobility helped spread their message quickly, appealing to rural populations that had been relatively isolated from established church structures. The Baptists also thrived, partly due to their congregational organization, which allowed individual churches to operate autonomously. This bottom-up approach resonated with Americans who valued local decision-making and a personalized faith experience. The result was a competitive and pluralistic religious marketplace, laying the groundwork for ongoing denominational diversity. 4.3. Social reform movements. Inspired by revival. One of the key contributions of the Second Great Awakening was its impact on social reform. Religious fervor not only transformed individual lives but also motivated collective action. Movements such as abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights all found support among revivalist circles. Activists used evangelical language to emphasize moral responsibility and the imperative to create a more just society. Abolitionism. Many evangelical Christians saw slavery as a grave sin and worked tirelessly to end the practice. Figures like Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, were inspired by religious convictions that emphasized compassion and moral responsibility. Temperance. Alcohol abuse was seen as detrimental to family and social well-being, prompting evangelical-driven movements to encourage abstinence or moderation in alcohol consumption. Women's rights. While many churches still restricted women's roles, the revivalist ethos encouraged women to speak publicly in prayer meetings and social reform societies. This platform helped spark broader discussions about the role of women in public life and eventually contributed to the women's suffrage movement. 4.4. Theological shifts and sectarian developments. The Second Great Awakening also birthed various new sects and movements. Groups like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, emerged, founded by Joseph Smith in the 1830s. The Shakers, who had already arrived in America, found renewed interest. The Millerites, led by William Miller, predicted the second coming of Christ, which contributed to the formation of Seventh-day Adventism. The Oxford Handbook details the theological nuances of these groups, showing how they adapted the evangelical spirit to unique doctrinal interpretations. Their emergence highlighted the fertile ground for spiritual experimentation in the rapidly expanding American frontier. Some of these groups faced persecution, fueling debates on religious tolerance that would shape the national discourse for decades to come. Chapter 5. The Civil War and Religious Transformation. 5.1. Religious tensions leading up to the Civil War. By the mid-19th century, the United States was increasingly polarized over the issue of slavery. Religious communities found themselves at the center of the moral debate, with Protestant denominations particularly divided between Northern and Southern factions. While many Northern evangelical churches joined the cause for abolition, citing biblical principles of human dignity and liberty, significant portions of the Southern clergy justified slavery through selective readings of Scripture. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America delves into the sermons, tracts, and theological arguments of this era, illustrating how spiritual beliefs bolstered political positions. Some congregations saw the conflict as a test of national righteousness, while others portrayed it as a tragic necessity to uphold a God-ordained social order. Indeed, the Civil War period exemplifies the complex interplay between faith, ethics, and regional identity in American history. 5.2. Chaplains, soldiers, and wartime spirituality. During the Civil War 1861-1865, chaplains and traveling preachers played a critical role in tending to soldiers' spiritual needs. Revivals took place in both Union and Confederate camps, offering emotional support and a sense of divine purpose to troops facing the horrors of battle. Prayer meetings became a routine part of camp life, with many soldiers undergoing conversions or reaffirming their faith on the front lines. However, the same religious zeal that comforted soldiers also stoked fierce convictions that God was on one side or the other. This polarization was deeply felt among Christian communities back home, where congregations prayed fervently for victory and safety for their loved ones at war. Such religious fervor contributed to the intensity of the conflict, intensifying convictions on both sides that their cause was morally justified. 5.3. Post-war crises of faith and reconstruction. The Civil War claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and left much of the South in ruins. This catastrophic loss of life challenged many Americans' belief in a just, benevolent God. Clergy and theologians grappled with existential questions. Why would God allow such bloodshed? And what did it mean for the moral compass of the nation? In the Reconstruction era that followed, Religious leaders played varied roles. Some advocated for reconciliation and supported efforts to integrate freed slaves into society, while others perpetuated racial hierarchies through Jim Crow laws and segregationist theology. Newly formed African American congregations provided spiritual refuge and community support, reflecting the resilience and agency of Black religious life despite systemic oppression. The impact on theology was profound. New strands of liberal theology, higher biblical criticism, and social gospel thinking began to emerge, questioning traditional dogmas and emphasizing moral responsibility toward the marginalized. In many ways, post-Civil War religious thought laid the groundwork for the next wave of reform movements that would sweep America at the turn of the 20th century. Chapter 6. The Gilded Age and the Social Gospel. 6.1. The Gilded Age Context. Spanning the late 19th century, the Gilded Age was marked by rapid industrialization, urbanization, and the accumulation of vast fortunes by a small class of industrial magnates. The era's name, coined by Mark Twain, suggests a thin layer of glitter, concealing deeper social problems such as poverty, corruption, and labor exploitation. In this climate, religious communities once again grappled with questions of social justice, wealth, and moral responsibility. Protestant churches, still the dominant religious force in America, began to face challenges posed by urban poverty and new immigrant populations from Southern and Eastern Europe. Catholic parishes grew rapidly with the influx of Irish, Italian, Polish, and other Catholic immigrants, transforming the demographic landscape. Meanwhile, Jewish congregations also expanded, especially in major cities like New York, where new Jewish immigrants arrived in large numbers. 6.2. Rise of the Social Gospel Movement. In response to the socio-economic disparities of the Gilded Age, certain Protestant leaders championed what became known as the social gospel. Figures like Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch advocated for applying Christian ethics to address societal ills, poverty, poor working conditions, racial injustice, and more. They argued that individual salvation was inseparable from collective well-being and that churches should actively campaign for systemic reforms. The social gospel movement introduced ideas that resonated with progressive politics. It influenced labor unions, settlement houses like Jane Addams' Hull House, and various reform initiatives aimed at uplifting marginalized communities. This emphasis on communal responsibility clashed with more conservative Christian voices who believed that religion should focus primarily on personal morality rather than political activism. 6.3. Catholic and Jewish approaches to social issues. Though the social gospel is primarily associated with Protestantism, Catholic and Jewish communities also address social problems in distinctive ways. The Catholic Church, for instance, emphasized its long-standing tradition of social teaching later crystallized in papal encyclicals like Rerum Novarum in 1891, urging the faithful to address workers' rights and the plight of the poor. Catholic lay organizations established schools, orphanages, and charitable societies, becoming vital support structures for immigrant communities. Jewish congregations, especially in urban centers, formed mutual aid societies, labor groups, and charitable associations to help newly arrived immigrants adjust to American life. The period saw the growth of Reform Judaism, which sought to modernize Jewish practices and engage actively with social concerns. In these overlapping yet distinct ways, different faith communities contributed to a tapestry of religiously inspired social activism during the Gilded Age. 6.4. Criticisms and lasting legacy. Despite its moral fervor, the social gospel movement faced criticism. Some argued it diluted core theological principles by focusing too heavily on political and economic reforms. Others pointed out that many social gospel advocates did not always recognize or confront racial injustices beyond the white working class, thus leaving an incomplete vision of social reform. Nevertheless, the legacy of the social gospel is profound. It laid a foundation for religious engagement in the public sphere, paving the way for future movements like the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. The emphasis on structural injustice and collective responsibility continues to influence Christian thought and activism well into the 21st century. Chapter 7: Immigration, Religious Diversity, and the Early 20th Century. 7.1 Waves of New Immigrants. From the late 19th to the early 20th century, the United States witnessed unprecedented levels of immigration. Millions arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe: Italians, Poles, Russians, Hungarians, many of whom were Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or Jewish. This influx profoundly altered the religious mosaic of America, challenging the earlier Protestant dominance. At the same time, immigrants from Asia, including Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos, faced significant discrimination, but also contributed new religious traditions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shinto. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America notes how these communities often formed tight-knit enclaves, building places of worship that became centers of cultural and social life. 7.2 The response of mainline Protestantism. Mainline Protestant churches initially struggled to adapt to the new pluralistic reality. Although some Protestant leaders launched missionary efforts aimed at Americanizing immigrants, others grew anxious about the erosion of a presumed Anglo-Protestant identity. Nativist sentiments fueled movements like the American Protective Association, which campaigned against Catholic political influence, and the Ku Klux Klan, which targeted Catholics, Jews, and people of color. However, there were also Protestant voices urging a more inclusive approach. Organizations like the Federal Council of Churches, founded in 1908, sought to foster interdenominational cooperation. These groups recognized that America's religious vitality owed much to its diversity, and that assimilation did not necessarily require abandoning cultural or religious traditions. 7.3 Catholic Parish Life and Religious Education. For Catholic immigrants, the parish was more than a spiritual home. It was the nexus of education, social services, and communal solidarity. Catholic parochial schools multiplied, providing an alternative to the public school system and safeguarding religious instruction. These schools helped preserve cultural traditions, e.g., teaching in Italian, Polish, or Spanish, while also inculcating American civic values. Religious orders such as the Jesuits, Franciscans, and Sisters of Mercy played leading roles in founding hospitals and charitable institutions. Through these efforts, the Catholic Church nurtured a sense of belonging for immigrant families, maintaining strong ties to ancestral homelands, while forging new American identities. 7.4 Jewish Communities and the Forward March of Reform, Conservative and Orthodox Movements. The early 20th century was a transformative era for Jewish Americans. Large numbers of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe populated neighborhoods like New York's Lower East Side, creating a vibrant hub of Yiddish culture and social activism. Over time, distinct expressions of Judaism evolved. Orthodox Judaism strove to preserve traditional religious law and customs, maintaining a close-knit communal structure. Reform Judaism promoted a more liberal interpretation of religious practice, adapting rituals and liturgy to align with modern life. Conservative Judaism emerged as a middle ground, seeking to balance respect for tradition with the need to adapt to contemporary society. These movements established synagogues, schools, and cultural institutions that shaped Jewish identity in America. Through newspapers, e.g., the Jewish Daily Forward, labor unions, and philanthropic associations, Jewish communities advocated for social justice causes and shaped public discourse in many cities. Chapter 8: Fundamentalism and Modernism in the Early 20th Century. 8.1 Defining Fundamentalism. Around the early 1900s, a movement emerged within conservative Protestant circles, reacting against modern biblical criticism, evolutionary theory, and what they perceived as theological liberalism. This movement became known as fundamentalism, taking its name from a series of pamphlets titled The Fundamentals, published between 1910 and 1915. These texts espouse beliefs considered essential to Christian orthodoxy, such as the inerrancy of Scripture, the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, and Christ's bodily resurrection. Fundamentalists championed a literal interpretation of the Bible and rejected theories they felt undermined biblical authority. They were particularly opposed to the teaching of Darwinian evolution in public schools, sparking political and cultural conflicts that would come to a head in events like the Scopes Trial of 1925. 8.2 The Modernist Approach. On the opposing side, modernists, often overlapping with liberal Protestants, embraced higher biblical criticism and were open to reconciling religious faith with modern science. They interpreted the Bible more metaphorically, viewing it as a product of historical context rather than an inerrant document. For modernists, adapting Christian doctrine to contemporary knowledge was key to keeping religion relevant. Modernists also championed the social gospels approach, arguing that Christianity should be engaged in social reform and justice. They believed that spiritual progress went hand in hand with societal progress, a stance that fundamentalists viewed as diluting core theological truths. 8.3 The Scopes Trial and the Culture Wars of the 1920s. The tension between fundamentalism and modernism reached a dramatic peak in 1925 during the so-called Scopes Monkey Trial in Dayton, Tennessee. High school teacher John T. Scopes was charged with violating state law by teaching evolution. The trial garnered national attention, with famed orator William Jennings Bryan arguing for the prosecution and famed lawyer Clarence Darrow defending Scopes. While Scopes was found guilty, though the verdict was later overturned on a technicality, the trial symbolized a broader cultural clash over science, religion, and public education. Fundamentalists saw the trial as defending biblical truth, whereas modernists and secular commentators viewed fundamentalism as antiquated and anti-intellectual. This culture war foreshadowed ongoing American debates around religion's role in public policy and education. 8.4 Legacy and Ongoing Tensions. After the 1920s, fundamentalist influence temporarily receded from mainstream institutions, but remained robust in separate denominational circles and independent churches. Over time, conservative evangelicalism evolved, eventually re-emerging as a powerful cultural and political force in the late 20th century, seen in movements like the moral majority and the Christian right. Modernists, on the other hand, shaped many mainline Protestant denominations, emphasizing ecumenism, social justice, and scholarly engagement with theology. The divides established in the early 20th century remain visible in contemporary American Christianity, manifesting in debates over biblical interpretation, social issues, and the nature of salvation. Chapter 9: The Great Depression and the Transformation of American Religion. 9.1 The Economic Crisis and its Impact on Churches. The Great Depression, 1929-1939, was a defining moment in American history. forcing individuals and institutions alike to confront widespread poverty and insecurity. Churches, be they Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, found themselves on the front lines of relief efforts. Their roles expanded beyond mere spiritual guidance, as clergy and laypeople organized soup kitchens, clothing drives, and emergency shelters. In many communities, churches collaborated with state and federal agencies, reflecting a growing acceptance of government intervention in social welfare. This new dynamic posed questions about the proper relationship between religious institutions and public programs. Should churches remain purely spiritual entities, or was direct involvement in social support part of their religious mission? Different denominations answered these questions in their own ways, influencing how they approach social justice and political engagement in the decades to come. 9.2. Theological responses to economic hardship. The theological landscape of the 1930s was marked by a renewed focus on social ethics. Many clergy members drew upon biblical themes of compassion and justice to advocate stronger protections for workers, the unemployed, and the marginalized. Certain Protestant circles revisited and deepened the social gospel principles introduced in the late 19th century, emphasizing collective responsibility for societal well-being. On the other hand, more conservative religious voices argued that moral reform and personal piety should take precedence over political activism. These leaders maintained that transforming individual hearts would naturally lead to improvements in economic and social conditions. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America highlights this tension, noting how it set the stage for ongoing debates about the extent to which faith communities should engage in social policy and systemic change. 9.3. Catholic Social Teaching and the New Deal. The Catholic Church found new impetus to articulate its social teachings during the Great Depression, especially in response to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs. While most Catholic bishops and theologians supported the New Deal's emphasis on social welfare, they also upheld the principles of subsidiarity, the idea that smaller communities and institutions should handle matters before larger entities, like the federal government, and solidarity, mutual responsibility, and care. Catholic thinkers, influenced by papal encyclicals such as Quadragesimo Anno 1931, underscored the moral obligation to protect human dignity in the workplace and ensure just wages. Catholic charities expanded their reach, coordinating relief services alongside government programs. This era cemented the Catholic Church's reputation as a significant moral and social advocate in American society. 9.4. Jewish relief efforts and the question of religious identity. Jewish communities were also active in providing relief, organizing through synagogues, B'nai B'rith lodges, and social service agencies. Many Jewish leaders approached the crisis with a dual commitment, aiding fellow Jews while extending support to the broader population. This dual focus reflected the historical Jewish mandate of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and also highlighted the challenges of balancing communal solidarity with integration into the wider American context. As the decade progressed, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, culminating in the Nazi regime, began to stir concerns among American Jews about global Jewish identity and persecution. While domestic economic hardships dominated day-to-day efforts, mounting international crises would soon reshape Jewish consciousness in America, setting the stage for intense debate on immigration, rescue efforts, and American intervention abroad. Chapter 10. World War II, the Cold War, and Religious Reconfiguration. 10.1. World War II and Religious Unity. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, a surge of national unity influenced religious communities of all stripes. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chaplains served together, ministering to troops of diverse faith backgrounds. This collaboration fostered an environment in which interfaith cooperation became more acceptable, laying the groundwork for a new sense of religious pluralism. On the home front, religious organizations rallied to support the war effort. They held prayer services for soldiers, organized blood drives, and engaged in war bond campaigns. This collective endeavor blurred denominational lines and promoted a shared sense of civic and spiritual duty. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America notes that WWII effectively accelerated religious Americanization, with many ethnic congregations adopting more English in their worship and identifying strongly with national causes. 10.2. Post-war religious boom and the Christian America narrative. Following the war, the United States experienced an era of economic prosperity and a baby boom that fueled the rapid growth of churches and synagogues. Houses of worship multiplied in new suburban landscapes, reflecting both the post-war construction boom and the revival of religious sentiment. Church attendance became a social norm, with many Americans seeing religion as a bulwark against moral decline and the perceived threat of communism. During the early Cold War years, political leaders promoted a Christian America narrative that positioned the nation against godless communism. In 1954, "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in 1956, "In God We Trust" became the national motto. While these measures were widely popular, critics argued that they conflated patriotism with a particular religious identity, potentially alienating religious minorities and non-believers. 10.3. Catholic ascendancy and changing Jewish identity. The post-war period saw significant growth and acceptance of American Catholicism. Catholics moved into suburbs, joined the expanding middle class, and increasingly participated in mainstream cultural and political life. The election of John F. Kennedy as the first Catholic president in 1960 symbolized the broader acceptance of Catholics in America's public sphere, though anti-Catholic prejudice persisted in some quarters. For American Jews, the post-war era brought economic opportunities and social mobility, culminating in a redefining of Jewish identity in the United States. Many Jews now embraced a more secular outlook or integrated cultural traditions with American practices. This period also saw the birth of new Jewish organizations focused on Israel, the Holocaust, and anti-discrimination efforts, which would become central to American Jewish life in subsequent decades. 10.4. Religious realignments during the Cold War. Religious life in the 1950s was not monolithic. Despite the rise in overall church membership, tensions persisted between fundamentalist and modernist Protestant groups. Meanwhile, new expressions of spirituality such as Pentecostalism continued to gain ground, especially among marginalized communities. The Cold War context also fueled missionary endeavors abroad, as American religious groups saw the struggle against communism as a spiritual battle. Many denominations poured resources into global evangelism, hoping to spread American-style Christianity as a bulwark against atheist ideologies. These international efforts both enhanced American religious influence worldwide and sparked critiques about cultural imperialism and religious hegemony. Chapter 11. The Civil Rights Movement and Religious Activism. 11.1. The Black Church as a Catalyst for Social Change. The Civil Rights Movement 1950s-1960s stands as a defining moment in American history, and its success was deeply intertwined with religious activism. Black churches in the South, including Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal congregations, emerged as epicenters of organization and resistance. Pastors like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. drew upon biblical theology and the prophetic tradition to inspire grassroots mobilization against segregation and racism. Church-based networks helped coordinate protests, boycotts, and voter registration drives. The moral authority wielded by Black clergy lent credibility to the cause, framing civil rights as not merely a political struggle, but a spiritual imperative. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America emphasizes how the movement's reliance on hymns, prayer vigils, and religious rhetoric unified participants and appealed to a broader national conscience. 11.2. Interfaith and ecumenical support. While the movement was primarily driven by Black Christian communities, it also received interfaith support. Catholic nuns marched in Selma, Jewish activists joined freedom rides, and mainline Protestant denominations contributed financial and moral backing. This ecumenical and interfaith solidarity showcased the potential for diverse faith traditions to rally around shared principles of justice and equality. At the same time, not all religious communities were in favor. Segregationist attitudes persisted among certain white Protestant churches in the South. Resistance to integration sometimes drew upon distorted biblical interpretations that justified racial hierarchies. These internal religious conflicts underscored the reality that American Christianity was far from monolithic on issues of race. 11.3. Theological shifts, liberation theology, and beyond. The Civil Rights era spurred theological innovation. Concepts akin to liberation theology, later more fully articulated in Latin America, found early roots in the preaching and writings of Black theologians who emphasized God's preferential concern for the oppressed. James Cone's groundbreaking works on Black liberation theology would further articulate these ideas in the late 1960s and 1970s, linking biblical exegesis with social justice advocacy. This shift influenced other marginalized groups, including Hispanic Latinx communities and feminist theologians, to re-examine Scripture through the lens of lived experience and structural injustice. As a result, religious activism increasingly expanded beyond civil rights to encompass broader calls for economic equality, gender justice, and anti-war efforts. 11.4. Impact on broader religious and political landscapes. The Civil Rights Movement fundamentally reshaped how religious organizations engaged with public policy. Many denominations reevaluated their mission statements, adopting official positions on racial equality, economic injustice, and peace. These institutional commitments planted the seeds for future social movements such as the anti-Vietnam War protests, the women's rights movement, and environmental advocacy, where religious voices would again play a pivotal role. However, backlash was inevitable. Conservative religious groups accused civil rights activists and progressive churches of politicizing the gospel. The schism created by these divergent viewpoints contributed to the rise of a politically active conservative evangelicalism in the late 20th century, setting the stage for ongoing cultural and theological debates that reverberate to this day. Chapter 12. The 1960s. Vatican II and Religious Pluralism. 12.1. The 1960s. Counterculture and Challenges to Traditional Religion. The 1960s were a decade of upheaval and radical cultural transformation, marked by the anti-war movement, the sexual revolution, and a broader youth rebellion against established authority. Many young Americans questioned traditional religious institutions, which they saw as complicit in war, racism, and social conformity. Church attendance among younger demographics declined, and alternative spiritual movements began to gain traction. At the same time, the civil rights victories and feminist activism emboldened individuals to critique patriarchal or exclusionary practices within religious communities. These critiques ranged from demands for women's ordination to challenges of racial segregation within church congregations. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America underscores how the 60s opened the door for experimental theology, interfaith dialogue, and the rise of spiritual but not religious identities. 12.2 Vatican II and Catholic Renewal. One of the most significant religious events of the 20th century was the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, convened by Pope John XXIII and continued under Pope Paul VI from 1962 to 1965. Vatican II aimed to update Aggiornamento the Catholic Church, introducing sweeping reforms in liturgy, church governance, and interfaith relations. Key changes included allowing the use of vernacular languages in Mass, encouraging lay participation, and fostering dialogue with other Christian denominations and non-Christian faiths. American Catholics embraced these changes with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some welcomed the modernized liturgy and expanded roles for the laity, while traditionalists lamented what they viewed as a loss of sacred mystery. Over the following decades, Catholic parishes in the U.S. experimented with folk music in worship, social justice ministries, and ecumenical outreach, reflecting the broader cultural shifts of the era. 12.3 Religious Pluralism and the Immigration Act of 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the national origin quotas that had limited immigration from Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. This reform precipitated a new wave of immigrants from non-Christian backgrounds, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Sikhs, and others, thereby expanding America's religious tapestry. This influx of diverse faith traditions prompted the development of new temples, mosques, and cultural centers across the nation. Religious pluralism became more visible, especially in urban areas like New York, Los Angeles, and Houston. American religious scholars, sociologists, and theologians found themselves grappling with questions of interfaith relations, civic integration, and the meaning of religious liberty in a vastly more heterogeneous society. 12.4 Ecumenical Movements and Interfaith Dialogue. The ecumenical spirit of the 1960s was not confined to Catholicism. Mainline Protestant denominations also launched initiatives to bridge denominational divides. The World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches in the U.S. promoted cooperation on social issues such as poverty, civil rights, and global peace. Meanwhile, interfaith dialogue expanded beyond Christian ecumenism to include Jewish, Muslim, and other religious representatives. Conferences and study groups sought to find common ground in ethical teachings, social justice, and community service. While theological differences remained, these efforts signaled a growing acknowledgement that religious harmony was possible and perhaps necessary in an era marked by rapid social change and geopolitical tension. Chapter 13. The 1970s. Charismatic Renewal, Feminist Theology, and Religious Reforms. 13.1. Charismatic Renewal and the Rise of Pentecostal Influence. The 1970s witnessed the rapid spread of the charismatic renewal within mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic communities. Originating in earlier Pentecostal movements, this renewal emphasized gifts of the Spirit such as speaking in tongues, prophecy, and healing. What distinguished the 1970s charismatic wave was its ecumenical appeal. People from Baptist, Lutheran, Episcopal, Methodist, and even Catholic backgrounds began to adopt Pentecostal-style worship practices. Large conferences and prayer gatherings drew crowds seeking a more experiential form of faith, one that stressed personal encounter with the Holy Spirit. Musically, this movement popularized contemporary praise songs and drove a flourishing Christian music industry. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America notes that this widespread adoption of charismatic worship styles profoundly reshaped the liturgical life of many congregations, blurring denominational boundaries and boosting the global appeal of American-style evangelicalism. 13.2. Feminist Theology and the Push for Women's Ordination. Building on the feminist momentum of the 1960s, religious women in the 1970s intensified their call for equality within church structures. Feminist theologians such as Rosemary Radford Ruether and Elizabeth A. Johnson challenged patriarchal interpretations of Scripture and tradition. They argued for reading biblical texts with a focus on women's experiences and contributions, both past and present. Mainline Protestant denominations, including the Episcopal Church and various Lutheran and Methodist bodies, began to ordain women during this period, sometimes amid intense controversy. Catholic women, meanwhile, pressed for expanded roles in ministry, though the Vatican maintained its position against women's ordination. Despite resistance, feminist theology gained traction across denominations, encouraging broader conversations about gender, language for God, and the embodiment of justice within religious communities. 13.3. Liturgical Reforms and Inclusive Language. Liturgical reforms weren't confined to the Catholic Church after Vatican II. Other Christian communities explored new worship forms, incorporating inclusive language that recognized both male and female images of the divine. Hymnals were revised, prayers were rewritten, and certain scriptural translations took gender-neutral or gender-inclusive approaches. These efforts reflected broader cultural shifts toward recognizing equality and the diverse experiences of believers. Not all believers welcomed these changes. Some conservative groups perceived inclusive language and revised liturgies as doctrinal compromise. Tensions flared over how best to remain faithful to biblical texts while also addressing modern understandings of equality. The Oxford Handbook highlights how these debates illustrated a broader struggle within American religion, the push and pull between tradition and innovation. 13.4. Ecological concerns and the emergence of eco-theology. The 1970s also saw a growing environmental awareness, spurred by events like the 1970 Earth Day and the publication of works such as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962. In response, many religious communities began to articulate theological perspectives on caring for creation, often termed eco-theology. Leaders in various denominations called for conservation and sustainability as a moral responsibility, linking scriptural teachings on stewardship to modern environmental crises. Jewish and Christian organizations collaborated on environmental advocacy, while indigenous spiritual traditions, long rooted in respect for nature, gained new visibility. Eco-theology would expand significantly in the following decades, influencing how congregations approached worship, community gardening, and political activism on climate issues. Chapter 14. The 1980s. Rise of the Christian Right and Religious Polarization. 14.1. Emergence of the Christian Right. The 1980s saw the ascendancy of conservative evangelical and fundamentalist movements in American politics, often referred to collectively as the Christian Right. Groups like the Moral Majority, led by Jerry Falwell, and the Christian Coalition, later spearheaded by Ralph Reed, mobilized millions of evangelicals to vote based on family values issues, opposition to abortion, support for traditional marriage, and advocacy for prayer in public schools. These organizations built extensive media networks and political action committees, influencing elections at local, state, and national levels. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America points out that the Christian right reshaped the Republican Party, forging alliances with conservative Catholics and Mormons around shared moral concerns. Critics, however, argued that these movements conflated religious doctrine with partisan politics, raising questions about church-state separation and religious pluralism. 14.2. Televangelism and the media boom. Parallel to the political rise of the Christian right was the explosion of televangelism. Figures like Pat Robertson, Jim Bakker, and Jimmy Swaggart gained national fame through cable television and satellite broadcasting. They reached audiences of millions, preaching sermons, fundraising for massive ministry projects, and at times intervening in political debates. Televangelism cultivated a celebrity culture around charismatic preachers, some of whom faced scandals involving financial mismanagement and personal misconduct. Nonetheless, this media wave demonstrated the power of religious broadcasting to galvanize supporters and shape public discourse on moral and social issues. The era set the stage for today's multi-platform religious media landscape, from cable TV to online streaming. 14.3. Mainline decline and the growth of independent megachurches. While conservative evangelicalism gained momentum, many mainline Protestant denominations, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and others, faced a noticeable decline in membership. Demographic shifts, theological controversies, and competition from vibrant evangelical congregations all contributed to this trend. Mainline churches often struggled to retain younger congregants who found the worship styles and cultural engagement of evangelical or independent churches more appealing. This period also saw the rise of large independent megachurches like Willow Creek Community Church in Illinois and Saddleback Church in California. These congregations attracted thousands of attendees each weekend through contemporary music, practical sermons, and extensive youth and children's programs. Their success signaled a broader shift in American religious life toward experiential worship, entrepreneurial leadership, and highly organized ministry structures. 14.4. Religious polarization and culture wars. By the late 1980s, the phrase culture wars had entered the national lexicon. Issues such as abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, and the role of religion in public schools became flashpoints. Liberal religious voices supported reproductive rights and greater inclusion of LGBTQ+ individuals, while conservative groups doubled down on traditional teachings regarding sexuality and family structure. This polarization extended beyond Christianity. Jewish communities, for instance, debated the intersection of halakhic law, Jewish religious law, with modern ethical issues, while Muslims navigated how to practice faith in a society increasingly divided over moral codes. America's religious landscape splintered along ideological lines, shaping the politics and social debates that would define the 1990s and beyond. Chapter 15. The 1990s. Diversity, New Spiritualities, and the Rise of Knowns. 15.1. Expanding religious diversity. The 1990s cemented the religious pluralism spurred by the 1965 Immigration Act. Large communities of Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and Sikhs matured, particularly in coastal urban centers. Mosques, temples, and gurdwaras became more visible, and interfaith councils began to address shared social challenges such as educational disparities, poverty, and racial tension. Academic interest in world religions grew, with universities establishing new departments and research centers dedicated to the study of non-Christian faiths in America. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America points out that these developments help normalize the presence of diverse religious traditions in public life, although incidents of discrimination persisted, especially toward Muslim and Sikh communities. 15.2. The New Age Movement and Alternative Spiritualities. While many Americans remained within established religious traditions, the 1990s also saw a surge in so-called New Age and alternative spiritualities. Practices such as meditation, astrology, crystal healing, and channeling spiritual guides gained popularity, often packaged as self-help or wellness regimes. Oprah Winfrey's talk show, among other media platforms, introduced mainstream audiences to metaphysical concepts, personal transformation narratives, and spiritual gurus. Critics dismiss these trends as consumerist or superficial, but defenders argued that New Age spirituality fulfilled a need for personal meaning and holistic well-being outside traditional church settings. Bookstores devoted entire sections to esoteric and New Age titles, and weekend workshops proliferated, catering to seekers wanting to explore everything from past life regression to energy healing. 15.3. Spiritual but not religious, and the rise of the knowns. Beginning in the 1990s, sociologists observed a growing number of Americans identifying as spiritual but not religious SBNR. These individuals often rejected institutional authority yet valued personal spiritual exploration, drawing from multiple traditions, Christian, Buddhist, Native American, or otherwise, to form individualized belief systems. Over time, the SBNR demographic has grown into a significant portion of the U.S. population. Closely related is the rise of the knowns people who, when asked for their religious affiliation, answer none. While some knowns are atheist or agnostic, many simply do not align with any organized denomination. The Oxford Handbook describes this as a sea change in American religious identity, prompting churches and synagogues to rethink outreach strategies, while also challenging the notion that religiosity necessarily correlates with institutional membership. 15.4. Technology, Media, and Religion. The 1990s saw the Internet revolution begin, alongside the proliferation of cable television. Religious organizations experimented with websites, email newsletters, and early social media platforms to connect with members and broadcast messages. Televangelists and radio preachers adapted to online environments, setting the stage for the digital religious sphere that would expand dramatically in the 20th century. Meanwhile, mass media produced religious-themed films and TV programs that sometimes sparked controversy. Shows like Touched by an Angel or films like The Last Temptation of Christ highlighted public interest in spiritual narratives and moral questions. This interplay of faith and entertainment foreshadowed an even more media-saturated religious landscape in the new millennium. Chapter 16. The Early 21st Century. Post-9/11's Religious Dynamics and Digital Faith. 16.1. Post-9/11's Landscape. Islam in the Public Eye. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, dramatically shifted American religious discourse. Islam, previously a minority religion that often operated below the broader cultural radar, suddenly became the focus of national attention. Many American Muslims faced increased scrutiny, hate crimes, and suspicion, even as interfaith organizations and civil rights groups worked to combat Islamophobia. During this period, Muslim advocacy groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAR, became more prominent, addressing civil liberties issues and educating the public about Islamic beliefs and practices. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America notes that post-9/11's tensions underscored the fragile nature of religious pluralism, highlighting both the resilience of interfaith solidarity and the vulnerabilities faced by minority communities. 16.2. Evangelical Resurgence and Political Influence. In the aftermath of 9/11's conservative evangelicalism surged again, particularly around themes of national security, patriotism, and moral clarity. Figures like Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. drew large audiences, and megachurches continued to expand. Evangelical voting blocs proved influential in elections, shaping debates on terrorism, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and domestic social policies. Critics argued that the conflation of evangelical Christianity with aggressive foreign policy perpetuated a harmful us versus them worldview, sometimes feeding anti-Muslim sentiment. Still, many evangelical denominations also expanded humanitarian outreach, supporting global missions and relief efforts in conflict zones, demonstrating the complexity of religious political engagement in the early 20th century. 16.3. Digital faith communities and social media. By the early 2000s, the rise of broadband internet and social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube transformed the way religious communities communicated. Churches livestreamed services, posted sermons online, and used email lists to mobilize volunteers and donors. Social media also facilitated the growth of online-only faith communities, where members interact virtually rather than in physical congregations. This digital shift opened new possibilities for evangelism, pastoral counseling, and global networking. Faith leaders could connect with younger demographics more easily, but also faced challenges such as digital misinformation, online harassment, and the potential for echo chambers. Nonetheless, the move toward a tech-savvy religious sphere was well underway, setting the foundation for even more digital innovation in the decades to follow. 16.4. Continuing debates over religious liberty and pluralism. The early 20th century has seen ongoing court battles and legislative controversies over religious liberty, from debates about displaying the Ten Commandments on public property to conflicts over healthcare mandates and LGBTQ+ rights. Faith-based advocacy groups on both ends of the political spectrum have lobbied lawmakers and supported legal cases seeking to define the boundaries of church-state separation. Meanwhile, new forms of religiosity, including secular spirituality, eco-spirituality, and multicultural interfaith practices flourish in an increasingly post-denominational landscape. The Oxford Handbook suggests that the tension between an evolving religious pluralism and attempts to legislate morality remains a dominant undercurrent in American public life, ensuring that questions of faith, freedom, and diversity will continue to shape the nation's social and political fabric. Chapter 17, the 2010s, Religious Pluralism, Social Movements, and Intersectional Activism. 17.1. Evolving Religious Pluralism and New Demographics. By the early 2010s, the demographic landscape of American religion was more varied than ever. Immigration continued to diversify Christian communities while boosting Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist populations. Younger Americans increasingly identified as religiously unaffiliated nones, driving sociologists and faith leaders to explore strategies for engaging a generation skeptical of institutions. Meanwhile, robust interfaith coalitions emerged in urban centers, tackling issues like homelessness, racial injustice, and refugee assistance. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America underscores that the 2010s witnessed a significant normalization of multi-faith dialogues. Events such as interfaith iftars during Ramadan, joint Passover seders, and Christian-Muslim peace forums became more common. These efforts demonstrated both solidarity across religious lines and a broader cultural acceptance of diversity. 17.2. The influence of social movements on religious communities. Several powerful social movements gained momentum in the 2010s, influencing religious communities in profound ways. Black Lives Matter (BLM). Founded in 2013, BLM sparked urgent conversations about systemic racism and police violence. Many historically black churches supported the movement, while progressive white congregations began to confront their own complicity in racial injustice. Ecumenical groups organized prayer vigils, workshops on anti-racism, and public demonstrations of solidarity. Me Too. This movement, which went viral in 2017, focused on sexual harassment and assault. It prompted religious institutions to re-examine policies on pastoral misconduct, gender-based discrimination, and abuse reporting. Women's ministries and feminist theologians saw an opening to push for greater accountability and leadership roles. Climate activism. Building on eco-theology from earlier decades, younger faith groups galvanized around environmental concerns. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim youth coalitions endorsed green initiatives, linking scriptural mandates of stewardship to modern ecological advocacy. Congregations planted community gardens, installed solar panels, and lobbied for environmental legislation. Religious organizations often wrestled with whether to support these movements overtly. Conservative congregations sometimes criticized them as politically partisan, while liberal and mainline denominations embraced activism as an expression of social gospel principles. 17.3. Increasingly intersectional activism. Activism in the 2010s was marked by an intersectional awareness, recognizing that forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, and economic injustice, overlap. Progressive congregations and religious advocacy groups acknowledge that faith-based social justice must address multiple issues simultaneously. For instance, a church protesting anti-black racism might also champion LGBTQ+ rights, immigrant protections, and environmental justice. This holistic perspective propelled many religious activists to form alliances with secular advocacy organizations. The Oxford Handbook notes that this blending of religious and secular activism represented a departure from older models of reform, limited to narrowly defined church-based missions. 17.4. Tensions and divisions. Not all religious communities embrace these intersectional agendas. Conservative evangelicals, traditional Catholics, and Orthodox Jews often oppose certain social movements on doctrinal grounds, particularly regarding sexuality, gender identity, and reproductive rights. Such disagreements sometimes led to denominational schisms, with congregations splitting over whether to affirm same-sex marriage or ordain LGBTQ+ clergy. These divisions echoed longer-standing theological rifts, illustrating that while some segments of American religion moved toward inclusive activism, others reaffirmed traditional interpretations of Scripture and doctrine. The 2010s thus became a decade of both unity and discord, reflecting an ever-broadening spectrum of belief and practice within the nation's religious mosaic. Political realignments and the Trump era 2016-2020. 18.1. Evangelical support and political polarization. The election of Donald J. Trump in 2016 marked a turning point in American political and religious discourse. White evangelical Protestants emerged as one of Trump's most steadfast voting blocs, with many citing his stance on conservative judges, religious liberty, and opposition to abortion as key motivators. Meanwhile, mainline Protestants, minority faiths, and religiously unaffiliated voters tended to lean more progressive, deepening existing polarization. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America observes that Trump's presidency became a lightning rod for debates on the proper role of religion in politics. Supporters championed his administration's defense of traditional values and religious freedoms, particularly concerning issues like prayer in school and tax exemptions. Opponents criticized what they saw as Christian nationalism, xenophobic immigration policies, and the blending of partisan rhetoric with spiritual language. 18.2. Catholic and other religious alignments. Catholic voters were split during the Trump era. While many conservative Catholics approved of Trump's judicial appointments and anti-abortion policies, other Catholics highlighted the Church's teachings on social justice, the dignity of migrants, and caring for the poor, values they believed were compromised by the administration's approach to immigration and health care. Likewise, Muslim Americans, Jewish communities, and non-Christian minorities frequently opposed the Trump administration's travel bans and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Interfaith coalitions challenged executive orders, organizing rallies and legal challenges to defend refugees and promote religious pluralism. These actions underscored a deep divide within American religion over how to balance national security concerns with compassion and hospitality for newcomers. 18.3. The America First Agenda and Christian Nationalism. The slogan America First resonated with groups advocating for stricter borders and a stronger national identity. Some conservative Christian leaders framed these positions in theological terms, arguing that God had specially blessed the United States and that protecting its sovereignty was a moral imperative. This viewpoint, sometimes referred to as Christian nationalism, posited a unique covenant between America and God. Critics pointed out that Christian nationalism often ignored or downplayed America's history of religious diversity, casting suspicion on non-Christian communities. They warned that conflating patriotism with a singular religious identity threatened the constitutional principle of church-state separation, while also fueling social tensions. 18.4. Conflict and realignment within denominations. Trump's presidency spurred intense debates within denominations, from Southern Baptist conventions to Catholic parishes. Younger evangelicals, in particular, expressed discomfort with the political direction of their elders, citing concerns about racism, sexism, and xenophobia. Some left traditional congregations altogether, joining progressive or non-denominational churches that embraced inclusivity and social justice. At the same time, conservative believers found a renewed sense of purpose in defending traditional values. They viewed critiques of the Trump administration as attacks on biblical authority and religious liberty. The Oxford Handbook notes that these internal rifts contributed to an ongoing reshaping of American religious identity, with the gap between conservative and progressive faith communities widening more than ever before. The COVID-19 pandemic, virtual worship, community care, and new fault lines. 19.1. Lockdowns and the shift to online worship. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in early 2020, state and local governments implemented lockdowns and social distancing measures that directly impacted houses of worship. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples temporarily closed their doors, prompting a rapid pivot to online services via live streams and video conferencing platforms. Pastors and rabbis taught Zoom-based classes, and congregants gathered for virtual coffee hours. While some traditions such as megachurch evangelicals were better positioned to make this transition due to existing media infrastructures, smaller congregations faced technical challenges. Nonetheless, the pandemic accelerated the digitalization of faith communities. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America highlights this period as a technological leap, one that expanded religious reach but also raised questions about intimacy, authenticity, and the digital divide among the faithful. 19.2. Debates over religious freedom and public health. Religious freedom controversies emerged when certain pastors and congregations defied shutdown orders, holding in-person services despite public health advisories. They argued that worship was an essential service protected by the First Amendment. Others contended that loving one's neighbor involved following science-based guidelines to prevent viral spread. Lawsuits erupted across the country, with courts sometimes issuing conflicting rulings on whether governments could limit in-person religious gatherings. These legal battles underscored enduring tensions between individual religious liberties and collective health responsibilities. They also revealed ideological divides within religious communities themselves, as some believers prioritized safety while others insisted on the inviolability of in-person worship. 19.3. Community care and interfaith solidarity. Amid the crisis, many faith groups stepped up to provide food banks, mental health support, and emergency relief funds. Interfaith coalitions organized donation drives for protective equipment, and religious charities partnered with local governments to serve vulnerable populations. In some areas, Gurdwaras Sikh temples distributed free meals langar, regardless of recipients' religious background, highlighting a spirit of collective care. This collaborative ethos extended to virtual interfaith prayer services, where leaders from diverse traditions prayed for medical workers, COVID-19 victims, and global healing. The Oxford Handbook notes that while the pandemic created new social distances, it also fostered a sense of shared vulnerability and interdependence, reminding believers of core teachings on compassion and unity. 19.4. Economic and social strains on religious institutions. The economic fallout from the pandemic put considerable strain on religious institutions. With fewer in-person donations and increased unemployment among congregants, many churches and synagogues faced budget shortfalls. Some closed permanently, while others merged with nearby congregations or sold properties to remain solvent. Socially, the lack of in-person fellowship frayed community bonds, particularly affecting older members who were less adept at online communication. Youth and young adults, accustomed to digital technology, adapted more readily, but sometimes felt disconnected from sacraments or traditional rituals. The aftermath saw a heightened awareness of the need to balance virtual engagement with embodied community experiences. Chapter 20. The Future of American Religion, Emerging Trends and Continued Debates. 20.1. Ongoing Decline in Institutional Affiliation. As we move further into the 2020s, statistics show continued growth in the religiously unaffiliated, those who identify as spiritual but not religious, atheist, agnostic, or simply none. This trend raises questions about the sustainability of traditional congregational models. Many denominations have seen membership age, budgets shrink, and fewer young people committing to ordained ministry. However, this does not necessarily indicate a decline in personal spirituality. Online communities, house churches, and informal faith gatherings flourish, reflecting a shift from institutional loyalty to flexible spiritual exploration. The Oxford Handbook of Religion in America posits that the lines between secular and sacred may blur even further as Americans craft individualized belief systems and practices. 20.2. Digital innovation, hybrid worship, and virtual reality. Technology will continue to reshape religious experience. Many congregations have adopted hybrid worship models, allowing participants to attend in person or online. Innovations like virtual reality church services, AI-driven spiritual counseling, and social media-based religious communities offer unprecedented opportunities for outreach, while also raising concerns about disembodiment, privacy, and authenticity. Digital tithing apps and cryptocurrency donations have emerged, indicating that even financial support for religious institutions is evolving. Some futurists predict a rise in metaverse ministries, where believers congregate in immersive virtual worlds. As these frontiers expand, religious leaders grapple with balancing technological convenience against the traditional value of face-to-face community. 20.3 Continued debates over gender, sexuality, and inclusion. The next decade will likely see ongoing controversies around gender roles, LGBTQ+ inclusion, and racial justice within religious communities. Progressive denominations will continue to affirm same-sex marriage and transgender clergy, while conservative bodies uphold traditional future trajectories as knowns continue to grow. As technology reshapes community life, and as social issues evolve, religion in America will remain dynamic and multifaceted, a testament to its capacity for renewal and reinvention. Thank you for joining us on this in-depth journey through the Oxford Handbook of Religion in America. If you found this exploration insightful, please give this video a like, drop your comments below, and subscribe to our channel, Exploring American Religion. Your engagement helps us continue producing content that delves into the heart of American spiritual life, past, present, and future. Let's keep the dialogue going and continue learning from one another about the ever-evolving tapestry of faith in the United States.